Good morning. This morning we're looking at Nehemiah chapter 2, verses 1 to 10. And I just want to start with a brief overview. Originally, the book of Ezra and Nehemiah were one single book. And what we know is that the Jews of Jerusalem had been taken off into captivity under the Babylonians. And then Babylon had fallen to the Persian Empire under Cyrus. And the book of Ezra starts with a decree put out by Cyrus saying that all captive peoples could return to their homelands. I want to show you something. This here is, turn it the other way around, this here is a gift shop version of the Cyrus cylinder, the original Cyrus cylinder, which is in the British Museum. And it's one of the earliest examples of a freedom charter. And the Iranian people are incredibly proud of this item. But what it enables us to see is that what we're dealing here with is history, real history. And it's also important to note, let me put that back, it's also important to note that the prophets, the biblical prophets, understood and interpreted history in light of God's purposes. So we see that throughout. So both of those things are quite important to realise. But as a result, we see at the beginning of Ezra that he says that God stirred Cyrus's heart to let the people return to Jerusalem. Now, Cyrus may have had a completely different motivation. He may have been concerned for security, to have a strong state that could be a buffer to Egypt. But nonetheless, the prophets viewed this very much as God's hand bringing the people back and using Cyrus to bring them back. And what we're told is that when the first cohort returned, the first thing they did was they built an altar. Their concern was about their relationship with God. That was the first thing, to restore the communion they had with God, between them and their God, so that the sin that blocked that relationship could be dealt with. So the altar was built and burnt offerings were presented on the altar. After that, they built the temple. So that's the congregation of the people. They can come together, they can worship. But Nehemiah's job, Nehemiah's calling, was to build the walls. And this was the interface between the people and the rest of the world. This wasn't first and foremost building a religious item or place. It was building a wall, a protective wall, which is a very interesting thing to note. Now, the passage begins with Nehemiah approaching the king. Well, Nehemiah, we're told that Nehemiah was bowed down with grief. And this wasn't Cyrus anymore. This was a king called Artaxerxes. And we're told that Nehemiah, on hearing that the city was in ruins, that the walls had been burnt, he was grief-stricken and he started to pray and fast. And he couldn't hide his sorrow. And he says, he admits, he said, I was really afraid coming before the king. And the king noticed how sad he was and asked him what the problem was. And Nehemiah said that the place where his ancestors were buried was in ruins and he wanted to return. This was an incredibly brave thing to do. He wanted to return to rebuild those walls. And more than that, he said, please could I have the materials I need for this project? And lo and behold, the king agreed. And not only did the king agree to give him the materials, the king also said, I'll give you a royal escort also, so that you'll be in safety by the time you get there. And so in the passage, it ends with Nehemiah arriving in Jerusalem, and two local officials called Sanballat and Tobiah are really not happy to see him return. And so, from there, I would like us to look at two particular points. So firstly, I would like to look at the relationship between the sacred and the secular that we learn from this passage. Now, this is quite pertinent for Brockley because we don't have full-time clergy in Brockley. We have Phil as our leader, but he also works. And Nehemiah wasn't a prophet, and he wasn't a priest, and he wasn't a king, but he was a cupbearer to the king. So he was extremely influential, and he was a very trusted official. But he would have grown up knowing about statecraft, and he would have understood how power worked very well. And God called him not to build a temple, but to build walls. So this wasn't a religious project. And he had no problem using official channels. You know, he asked for resources, he asked for the wood, he was happy to take the protection on his journey. And Nehemiah really understood that God granting this provision was an answer to prayer. So he says, "And because the gracious hand of my God was on me, the king granted my request." Now, just to return to the point that Ezra and Nehemiah were one book, I want to contrast that with something that Ezra says about himself. And he, in turn, is planning to return to Jerusalem with a party. And this is what Ezra says. "There by the Ahava Canal, I proclaimed a fast, so that we might humble ourselves before our God and ask him for safe journey for us and our children, with all our possessions. I was ashamed to ask the king for soldiers and horsemen to protect us from the enemies on the road, because we had told the king, the gracious hand of our God is on everyone who looks to him. But his great anger is against all who forsake him. So we fasted and petitioned our God about this, and he answered our prayers." So we have two godly, prayerful men with completely different understandings of what it means to trust God. And the original compilers of the text had no problem putting these stories next to each other. There was no indication that would lead you to suggest that one person was viewed as more godly than the other, or one task more holy. They were both operating entirely out of what God had trained them to be and do. And another point that I find quite interesting in the text is that Nehemiah says, "I was very much afraid." You see, Nehemiah's head and his livelihood entirely rested on his job at one level. And I was in full-time Christian work for many years. And the thing that happens when you're in full-time Christian work is that your income is actually much more secure than people in secular employment, because it comes from various sources. Lots of different people contribute. So if one person loses their job, that doesn't affect your entire livelihood. Whereas a person who is in a secular job, their entire livelihood goes if they lose their job. And so it's perfectly legitimate for Nehemiah to have been afraid, let alone afraid for his life. And so there's a question to ask here, really, isn't it? What does it mean to trust God in the various circumstances we find ourselves in? You can't view Ezra's actions as more godly than Nehemiah's. And it leads us to a place where we need to ponder the divide between the sacred and the secular that sometimes we have in our minds. So why was Nehemiah so distraught about the walls of Jerusalem? Well, Nehemiah was brought up with the surrounding religion being Zoroastrianism, and many aspects of that are not that different. There are strands of it that you find in the Judeo-Christian tradition. And yet, in the midst of that, he wasn't tempted to be assimilated into it. He had a very strong sense of how distinct he was and his people were. So there was a sense of his heritage, his identity, and his distinctiveness. And I think, and it's extraordinary that he maintained that while he was in exile, and which is why he responds so strongly. And it says, when I heard these things about the walls being broken down, I sat down and I wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heavens. And he wasn't praying for the temple walls. He was praying about the city walls and the state of the ruins of the surrounding places where people lived. So these were not religious walls. So what about these walls and boundaries? Because my experience in Christian communities over many years now is that we mainly talk about pulling down walls. And I know why, because we're told that Jesus has torn down the wall of hostility. And we know that Paul talks about there being neither Jew nor Greek, bond nor free, male nor female. And essentially, God is saying the power relations that have dominated and separated no longer exist. Everyone is now welcome on an equal footing at my table. And we know that there have been some real injustices that have needed to be dismantled and continue to need to be dismantled. And we know that there are boundaries that probably need to be moved. But Nehemiah, the book of Nehemiah, we need to remember, is not about tearing down walls. It's about restoring and building walls. And just as a slight digression, since the days I lived in Scotland, I've always been fascinated by dry stone walls. I've got you a picture of a dry stone wall here. Look, here we go. A fine picture of a dry stone wall. Now, the thing about dry stone walls is that they have no mortar in between them. So they're all sort of freestanding bricks. And their strength is determined by how they have been placed in the wall. And it's very much determined by the skill of the craftsman who shapes and places the stones. And the brilliance of a dry stone wall is that when the ground moves, it flexes with it. And because there's no mortar, it doesn't crack. And if it falls down, you can just rebuild it again. And it's a beautiful example of a wall that is adaptive and can both be a boundary, but isn't restrictive. And I believe that God has given us walls and boundaries, and that God likes walls and boundaries. It's important that I know where I end and you begin. Refugees don't want to live in tents. They want walls around them to protect them. And walls and boundaries can be firm or fluid. You see fluid boundaries in Impressionist paintings, but that doesn't make them less or more beautiful necessarily than realism. It depends what you like, really. And the boundaries and the walls that God gives are there to physically protect us in a fallen world. They also are important emotionally and psychologically. And probably the thing that I have learnt over a few years is that they're incredibly important to stop us getting overrun by spiritual forces of darkness. And that's why God cares about walls. And I think this is why that in the book of Revelation, that's Revelation chapter 12, walls are mentioned 6 times in relation to the holy city. And this is what the Apostle John was shown about the holy city. It had a great and high wall with gates, names of the 12 tribes, and the walls of the city had 12 foundation stones with the names of the apostles. And the one who spoke had a measuring rod to measure the city and its gates and its walls. The material of the walls were jasper. The foundations were adorned with every kind of precious stone. God has made the world so rich in diversity and definition, with traditions and cultures, and probably most importantly, unique individuals. And that uniqueness comes because there is boundaries and definitions between groups. And that's what enables us to stand back and appreciate and enjoy. Otherwise, we'd all merge into one thing. And I think that what I've learned is that it's a lot easier tearing down buildings and tearing down things than it is building things up. And I think that the lesson that God wants us to ponder on from the book of Nehemiah, and I believe this is what God wants the church to ponder on in our current world we live in, is that how as a church can we work alongside our master builder, who is the repairer and the restorer of the breach.